So I would like to welcome you all to our environmental philosophy talks. This is our 36th talk. And today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Derek Spoker from Ontology University. And Dr. Derek Spoker got his PhD in philosophy and literature from University of Sussex. He worked in many Istanbul universities and some universities. And since 2023, he has been in Boğaziçi University. And his publications include Derrida on deconstruction, Kierkegaard on politics, philosophy of the novel, and he has a new book chapter forthcoming on Foucault's Baroque, and recent journal articles have it on Derrida ethics. His main focus at the moment on liberty in people. Today he's going to give a talk titled Liberty and Ontology of Ethics in Foucault. It's an honor to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Okay, thank you. So my approach to presentations is a bit chaotic. I make a few slides. I don't read through it, but we've actually got a very long text here, which is work on progress for a book on liberty and Foucault, which I've been thinking about for a long time. So there's lots of material while I'm still shaping something I send to a publisher. So this is really from a draft material for a chapter in the book. So what I'll do is I'll start with a few quotations I found recently, which I find particularly stimulating. They relate to things that are already been working on at Foucault, but also focus. It's usually clear focus on some things about his attitude to liberty, how you find liberty that's related to. But so, as the title of the talk suggests, he links liberty to ethics. Quotation here: "The liberty is the ontological condition of ethics, but ethics is the reflective form liberty takes." Something suggestion there is of an interaction. And with something that's both ontological and reflective. Of course, ontological might suggest something very fixed and deterministic. When Foucault talks about ontology, he's really, certainly in this context, talking about our relation with ourselves and our social relations. They're not just in terms of discourse or social connections, but also in terms of our relations with our physical self, with our desires, with the needs of our body in regard to diets and health and so on. Of course, these exist in the social context for Foucault, but I don't think he's the kind of extreme social constructionist he sometimes represented as. Certainly, some of his later work, he has done a lot to say about how there's an ontology of the self, which is a reduction to our physical self, but it certainly has an interaction between our bodily self and the way that we shape our life. With some kind of liberty, of course. I think Foucault is sometimes represented as a kind of extreme determinist or an extreme pessimist about being weighed down by power, things like that. But he does have an idea of liberty, and he's not just suggesting with victims of power. He literally has a subjectivity, we have agency of some kind, which he refers to in terms of ethics. It's really ethics, but Foucault is really action on the self, self's action on the self. So his sense of ethics is not very moralistic in the sense it's not about being obligation to some external law. It actually emerges from our relation of ourselves. But that doesn't mean it's a kind of extreme egotism either. So another brief line from Foucault which helps orientate this: the ethic of care of the self as practice of liberty. So care of the self is a familiar term from Foucault's history of sexuality, well, particularly volume 3. So I better write up a few things. After all, I presume there's some variety of knowledge of Foucault here, and I don't want to just leave some people a bit puzzled why I go through loads of terms which are specific to Foucault. So I'll try and write up a few things. So care of the self. Particularly in antiquity. So a lot of what Foucault says, which is related to our ability, is about antiquity. But he doesn't just discuss these things in terms of antiquity. So there's a text on enlightenment, which looks at liberty in terms of Kant's ethics on enlightenment, and also in terms of a kind of aesthetic of liberty. We should get onto that fairly soon. And of course, there is lectures on neoliberalism actually gathered as lectures on violent politics. Of course, the idea of liberalism is connected to some idea of liberty. But I won't get into his views on neoliberalism because that's a huge topic in itself. Of course, that's something he discusses in the 21st century. Sorry, 25th century, excuse me. And of course, he's concerned with the background to that in society. Society must be defended is a kind of discourse, a series of lectures, the origins of liberalism. So there's issues here about what Foucault's relations are to liberal political theory. But I don't deal with that too much. I'm of course dealing with that in this book. But I'll look at some particular ways in which Foucault talks about liberty, and more or less leave open the question of how that might connect with views of liberty, autonomy, and so on. Of course, these are rather big and controversial issues for Foucault, political interpretation of Foucault. He himself, I think, enjoyed being rather ambiguous about what his politics were. Some people seem to be very sure they know what his politics are. I'm not quite so sure, though. I think there are some sort of very general things. Anyway, I don't really want to get into that today. I'm trying to look at the way he builds up views of liberty, mostly when he's discussing antiquity, Greek and Roman antiquity, but also, as I said, that essay on enlightenment, which was also an essay on a 19th century sense of poetic liberty. So care of the self. History of Sexuality, Volume 3. History of Sexuality as a title is not entirely misleading, but it's a bit misleading. Really, it's largely a book about ethics. It's just that in looking at attitudes towards the body, towards sexuality, erotic in the most general sense, that's the way in which Foucault is looking at this relation we have with ourselves. And it's not just sexuality he's concerned with in these lectures. It's the various other ways which relate to our body, which include diet, things we do for health, the interpretation of dreams, which is going on in antiquity, antique ideas of self-control, the emergence of thinking about asceticism. So actually, a kind of forms of denial of the body. The language shows are connected to some kind of belief that benefits our health or well-being in some way. So another quotation: "The care of the self in the ancient, Greek Greco-Roman world was the fashion in which individual liberty or civic liberty up to a point is reflected as ethics." So Foucault takes his discussion of care of the self as actually not just thinking about individual liberty, but about civic liberty. So political issues. I mean, he says civic liberty up to a certain point, but he's not excluding it. The one point that Foucault makes, in contrast to some widespread views about liberty in the ancient world, is he doesn't agree that it's we should see the ancients as being different to individual liberty. Particularly refers to Hegel's view on this. There are various other people who said very similar things. So, okay, so liberty in the ancient world is care of self. Civic liberty, as well as individual liberty. Again, Hegel the ancients do not they did not ignore, deny ancient liberty. Individual liberty, excuse me. Okay, I mean that kind of way of thinking about intellectual liberty, it doesn't just start Hegel precedes Hegel and carries on after Hegel in people rather unrelated schools of thought. Well, that is a significant point about what Foucault has to say about antiquity. We can look to antiquity with regard to individual liberty, not just civic liberty. I suppose the short version of the position that Foucault is contesting, you can find in a famous essay by Benjamin Constant, French political theorist, also a novelist. Well, he was contemporary of Hegel. But the liberty, I've got the title the wrong way around, but about the liberty of the ancients compared to that of the moderns. Okay, so this is a very famous brief text. It was given as a lecture in political theory. Okay, so it's a view that the ancient Greeks and Romans, of course, these discussions are always about the Greeks and the Romans, not other antique peoples. So, of course, the Greeks and Romans are left more text than other antique peoples about these questions. So the view that we're coming across in Hegel and Constant and so on is that for the Greeks and Romans, the liberty is really about freedom from internal tyrant and freedom from an external conqueror. That liberty is seen in very communal and collective terms. So it's the kind of thing that I emphasized in the very discussing liberty of the ancients. It's point out that even in Athens, often taken as most free ancient society, an annoying individual could be executed. Obviously, we can think of Socrates. So there seems to be a limited appreciation of the right of the individual to be different from majority culture. Okay, I mean, of course, there's probably something to that, but Foucault's point is that you get emphasis to the way that the ancients are concerned with a form of cultivation of the self, and that's liberty. So Foucault would say the more political questions, or more obviously political civic questions of liberty, can only really have meaning. We have this kind of self-cultivation anyway. So this self-cultivation, what he calls care for self, I suppose that achieves a more obviously political aspect in the Roman world, Foucault's analysis in the idea of government of others. Depends our capacity to govern ourselves. So obviously in Rome, it's talking about libertas. The Foucault talks about this really in the Roman context. So really, he thinks that the ancient Greeks have really developed a view of care for self, cultivation of the soul, which is actually also cultivation of the body. And it's in the Roman world that really gets expressed in political terms. Those Romans have political rights, though particularly the aristocracy have political rights, have liberty of some kind, because they have self-control, which entitles them to control of others. I can say more about that. Scotland. I guess I'm trying to concentrate on the ancient Greeks at the moment. And Foucault's argument, part of what he's saying, is we should look to the ancient Greeks for a model of individual liberty, even if it isn't so political. In a way, he's saying, despite what people have said about ancient ideas of liberty, we actually get more about individual liberty from the ancient Greeks than we do from political liberty. Political liberty in the ancient context, particularly being the freedom of a people as a whole from the domination of a tyrant or an external enemy, a position which might still leave open the possibility of a kind of enforcement of conformity, a kind of a communalist view. So I've written down a long quotation here. I'll just see if there's anything else you mention from that. Then we'll try and read the whole thing out. Okay, so he says that liberty is as a care for self is an issue throughout antiquity. Okay, so liberty of care of the self is an issue throughout antiquity. Though when he uses care for self, he's particularly referring to the ancient Greeks. So, as of when the Romans are following on from that. So, really, care for self is really a Greek concept for Foucault, he frequently uses the Greek term. So when talking about the ancient world, and particularly the Greek world, in some cases he frequently uses the Greek terms. Actually, the most strong case of this, I don't want to talk about this today, because it's a different topic, which is a different chapter of the book I'm working on. I gave a talk about this a few months ago anyway. But parrhesia. So Foucault always uses the ancient Greek term parrhesia, rather than trying to translate it, because you might translate it as free speech. The way he uses French terms, it's more like he talks about fearless speech or speech which risks death. So there's an issue here. So we don't want to get too much into that. This is a separate topic in the work I'm doing. Okay, but this actually comes from care itself. So issues of free speaking, which well, actually, of course, Foucault actually sees very plural versions of that. So I better not even start looking at that on the finish. But parrhesia is actually a form of care itself. And Foucault insists on using a Greek term. And he says that it can't really be used for the later societies. In fact, really, it's lost that meaning. Well, I suppose he thinks it's really dying the time in which the freedom of the Greek cities has been restricted by Alexander the Great. So even with their antiquity, Foucault thinks it's a rather brief period where there's an interest in freedom of speech, rather than parrhesia as a kind of speech which is more connected actually with kind of care of self. A kind of searching for a kind of purity of the self. So in some ways, Foucault has a very classical oriented view in the sort of narrow sense of classical from Athens at its, what is usually taken to its cultural philosophical creed. When these terms seem to have most life, in a way that's a rather traditional view. We take or a kind of idealizing view of antiquity. So that sense that Foucault fits into kind of discussions which have assumed a kind of idealization of antiquity, something we should go back to. I don't think Foucault is literally suggesting that. But in some ways, Foucault is very impressed by some aspects of antiquity, particularly ancient Athens in its classical period. And that's part of saying, well, we should go back to that period to look for a strong view of individual liberty. The kind of individual liberty which has an ontological basis. Of course, Foucault has his own use of ontology, but when he uses ontology, he's using the term ontology. He wants to say that this is something that is not just variable, something that just happens occasionally. It's a deep structure of the self. So the interest in care of the self itself is related to a concern of the deep structure of the self, which of course is concerned with the emergence of philosophy as we know it at that time. Of course, in this kind of work, Foucault sometimes seems rather close to kind of rather Aristotelian ideas of self-control. Anyway, I'll use the Greek term here since Foucault certainly does the various ways that Stone can transliterate it. So anyone who's studied ancient Athens would obviously be familiar with this. The importance of self-control or sophrosyne, perhaps something like that. So some way which Foucault always seems to be engaged with the anti-ethics. He doesn't do a great deal of commentary on ancient ethical texts, but he does a bit of that. He's more concerned with a more broad commentary on the culture, in which he seems to, in some ways, kind of overturn the way self-control might appear in Plato, Aristotle, and influences later Hellenistic and Roman philosophy written Greek and Latin. So there is this sense of hierarchy. Of course, we can see in this Roman sense that control of the self is the right to govern others. Foucault wants to suggest that we can sort of burrow into this ancient Greek thinking and see something else there, something a bit more individualistic, something that's not quite the way that Plato or Aristotle later thinkers think in terms of rather rigid internal, external hierarchies, and something which allows more for subjectivity, individuality, liberty. So I'm really good at checking time. How much time have I got left?
Roughly 20 minutes.
Right, so that halfway through. Well, anyway, I think it's time to get on to what he says about enlightenment. So there is a short text by Foucault, What is Enlightenment? Of course, that picks up on Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? So if you don't know much about Foucault, that might be a good place to start. Though, of course, it's written in a fairly dense and complex way. Okay, so jumping from the ancient Greeks to modernity, or enlightenment, the beginning of modernity, which is something that Foucault might have some caution about, but I think there's a tension here in Foucault, because sometimes he seems to be taking a very historicist approach. I only think of one of the books that made him famous early in his career, Order of Things. That's very much about how there are structures of thought in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, early modern period, 19th century. And so on the face of it, whereas the way we think in a certain period is very determined by a structure of thought. Actually, that's something I was looking at in the forthcoming book chapter that Foucault mentioned. I suppose I introduced some kind of questioning of how rigid we should think of Foucault's sense of there being different structures for different times. I think he sees those structures as unstable and not monolithic. But nevertheless, there's something real about the way that at any one particular time we call it a structure of thought. So as I said, he's rather emphatic that parrhesia can't be used outside the ancient Greek context. It's even tied to the word, because even just tying it to the word in the historical context, so the use is quite varied. He does address freedom of speech in the Enlightenment, particularly through Kant. In some ways, he addresses Kant to be rather skeptical about Kant. Kant is important to Foucault. He's not just dismissing Kant, but he does point out ways in which the essay "What is Enlightenment," which people might often take as this is where we get modern liberty and modern rationality, all good things. Foucault does a close reading, where he shows that actually what Kant says is probably not really what most people would think of in terms of the liberty of free speech, even though what Kant says is an important contribution to that discussion. So what Foucault does is to, well, first of all, he looks at there being different meanings of enlightenment. So this is what he's going to move on to, instead liberty. Okay, so Kant wanted to like Kant, that Foucault is respectful but very critical reading that. He also suggests that we look at 3 different kinds of views of history in Enlightenment. of course, that's the interesting thing about Foucault. In some ways, seems to be a historicist thinker. But there are three kinds of history in Enlightenment that in itself already complicates our view of what historicism is, because there must be at least three different versions of it. Yeah. So the view, Foucault links Enlightenment the views of history, and also points out that a lot of what we get in Enlightenment views of history actually there's a kind of end of history, and not so much in that more recent sense of the world becoming completely liberal, that's associated with Francis Fukuyama, but in something in a more apocalyptic sense. So, of course, when Foucault looks at Enlightenment, he wants to say, well, it's not quite, the cliche, it's not one of the things. It's not the straightforward triumph of reason over whatever the thing that isn't reason. And of course, Foucault himself wants to be critical of rationalism. Not that he's advocating irrationalism, but he wants to point out and introduce what rationality is. That Enlightenment, the supposed beginning of rationality, may not look all that rational. There might be some projection going on. And anyway, what rationality is debatable, and rationalism can have very negative consequences. I mean, that's something that comes up in the book, I suppose the first famous book by Foucault, The History of Madness, where he thinks a early modern distinction, as exemplified by Descartes, between reason and unreason, is both intellectually lacking and is linked with increasingly coercive attitudes to dealing with the mad, with the insane. Foucault's point is partly that there must be different kinds of reason, and that it must at least be a debatable point what the link is between reason and unreason, and that labeling people as mad and coercing them could be obscuring certain kinds of truths. At least, at the very least, the people labeled mad must have some truths about their experience, which must be of some value. So, getting back to what Foucault does as the kind of alternative to Kant, it is and the kind of alternative to this very the kind of stereotype of enlightenment he's criticizing. He jumps to Charles Baudelaire, the 19th century French poet, one of the major figures in the development of poetry and literature. He could actually have taken a bit of a detour through Kant's aesthetics. Doesn't choose to do that. I don't think he does that in any text that I can remember. Perhaps interesting, he doesn't have a look at Kant's aesthetics. Kant himself might be setting up a kind of aesthetic review of freedom in the critique of the power of judgment. What Foucault usually discusses in Kant is the rationalism and the attitude towards history, also the philosophical anthropology. Okay, so what's he doing with Baudelaire? He actually doesn't so much talk about poetry as focus on a rather famous essay by Charles Baudelaire, The Modern Painter, which is a discussion of actually a minor French painter of the time, at least not very well remembered. It's partly famous still as Voltaire, Benjamin, the German sort of cultural theorist and philosopher, also wrote about this essay. Now, Foucault doesn't actually refer to Benjamin, I don't think he deeply engaged with Benjamin. He has his own view of this. And really the view is, I'm going to check what I wrote recently about this. So there's a particular painter, Constantin Guy, who is defined as a dandy, a man of fashion, rather than a fleur, strolling observer of the city. So this is about life in Paris. The dandy exercises kind of self-denial, in which he brings out historical constrained poetic possibilities of what he is wearing, which brings out the beauty of the depraved animal that is humanity. So, of course, this is rather Baudelaire. There's a kind of pessimistic romanticism in Baudelaire. It's a bit dramatic in the sense that there's an interest in inner expression of the inner self through poetry about that to show rather dark things or relate to a rather dark view of society around the poet, or also a sense of the decline of poetry or the outside state of poetry in modern society. So the dandy isn't just the fashionable upper class person. The dandy is a kind of artist who's struggling with depravity. Because there's something innately depraved about humanity. So one attitude is to concentrate on the present and imagine it as something else. This is Foucault's words discussing Baudelaire. So one attitude is to concentrate on the present and imagine it as something else. So it's a poetic subjective translation. So dandy in the dandy. I suppose you talk about dandyism. I'm not sure Foucault wished to describe himself as a dandy, but of course he did project a kind of sense of himself through his appearance. Everyone's seen the pictures of him with a shaved head, glasses, the black polo neck jumper, the black leather jacket, these kind of images, which obviously he presents an image of himself. And obviously he has a decision at some part of his life, because you look at very early pictures of Foucault, he looks like a nerd, if I can put it like that. So he obviously decided to cultivate the image of himself as a bit of a hard man of philosophy. Actually, that's Camus. I don't know who's thinking of Camus, but Albert Camus did something else. They playing us pictures of Camus with a leather jacket and a cigar and cigarette. Excuse me. He's deliberately modeling himself on Hollywood, apparently. French philosophers model themselves on more sort of anti-heroes of Hollywood. Sorry, how much time have I got back? Right, okay. So, it demands a kind of asceticism in which we transform ourselves and even revolt against ourselves. But it's quite dense kind of thought there, which has a lot of associations. If you read the related text by Foucault. So asceticism, of course, that's something he discusses really at great length in various lectures and books about how Christian asceticism grows out of antique philosophy. And that is, it's of course interesting he emphasizes asceticism. It's always Foucault would seem to be the opposite of a Christian ascetic. He doesn't seem that kind of person, or of course he was a religious person. But I think Foucault's sense of an interest in the possibilities of self-creation, it actually means he's very interested in what, how a quite, extreme religious person might behave. That's fine with Foucault, as long as it's, what you do to yourself. And so I think he's interested in all kinds of ways which people create themselves. And in some ways, for Foucault, the growth of Christian asceticism is a great growth in the possibilities of what we can choose. Well, you wouldn't want to see this turned into a kind of compulsory social norm or anything like that. But any way in which humans in history have found new possibilities of being, self-creation, is very interesting for Foucault. It has some value. Of course, he also has some criticisms of what comes out of this form of Christian self-creation. It's more about how it develops later than how it first appears in, say, ascetic saints in the Syrian desert, this kind of thing. The way you see it later is in a kind of church power, and then that eventually becomes state power. And has its worst aspects of combining church and state power, the Inquisition, the use of state power law to persecute supposed heretics. So Foucault sees some dark things coming out of Christian asceticism, but not necessarily in how it initially emerges. course, rather famously, notoriously, something people often use against Foucault, is very interested in Shiite spirituality during the Iranian Revolution. So Foucault never goes deeply into Islam. He's actually got a lot to say about the history of Christianity. The time of the Iranian Revolution was very interested in Shiite spirituality, how that was influenced the revolution. Of course, this became famous, notorious, because Foucault at first was optimistic about how the Iranian Revolution would go. Some people, these making rather wild accusations against Foucault, haven't noticed that he very quickly criticised the abuses of power, which Ayatollah Khomeini, certainly from any kind of liberal democratic point of view, Ayatollah Khomeini was very abusive of power once he took power himself. Because Foucault was very quick to criticise that. But before Khomeini took power, actually a quite long process of the revolution, in which various sectors of Iranian society united against the Shah. And Foucault had some contacts with Shiite clerics, and also sort of observant Muslims who were involved in the political opposition. So he found them to be quite sympathetic, but he didn't like what Khomeini came to power. I guess it's a diversion, perhaps. We're going to talk about Foucault and just spirituality. We should perhaps think about that or be aware of it. So the Enlightenment, anyway, getting back to Kant and the 18th century, the Enlightenment exemplified by Kant links the progress of truth and the history of liberty. So there's kind of an assumption in Kant that our rational self seeks truth, and that our liberty is the rational liberty we have, the reason, the autonomy we have as rational beings. Now that's something that develops over history. There's a kind of historicism in Kant, because I don't think all Kantian people particularly like that emphasis, but Foucault sees historically elements in Kant. So our attitude towards the Enlightenment should concentrate on what is necessary, what is not necessary for the preservation of our autonomy, contemporary limits of the necessary, without challenging the essential parts of Enlightenment reason. Kind of my paraphrase or summary of a passage from Foucault. Freedom then comes from a genealogy, which shows what is not necessary. So Enlightenment itself is not so great if it only makes us think about a kind of singular view of what truth and liberty is. But then it might also lead us to make a distinction between what is the necessary limits we face. Julie, Foucault particularly expand on what he means at this point. It simply means that we must face some kind of constraints to living in society. There must be some kind of law, some kind of morality, some ways in which we restrain ourselves in order to live in a society. I think Foucault always emphasizes the self-forming version of that, self-creating version of that as the version that he appreciates. So freedom then comes from genealogy, which shows what is not necessary. So of course, picking up on Nietzsche's use of the term genealogy, suggesting because genealogy suggests that terms, also social structures, change over history. They have a different meaning in their origin than what they have later. So you could say it's a way of thinking which emphasizes contingency. Foucault wants to emphasize contingency and choice. So the growth of capabilities is often conflicted with freedom. So technological capabilities, technology in the broad sense, the way in which humans develop. Technology in the narrow sense, or develop physical structures, legal structures, which constrain us. So those kind of capabilities and threaten liberty, we often do. It is Foucault's aim to avoid this by disconnecting capabilities from power relations. This requires an ethos, philosophical way of life, in which we exercise a critical ontology, where we criticize ourselves and examine the historical limits of what we can be. Of course, this is again the strong Foucauldian use of ontology, about ourself as something that we act on, because it's not just a self-creation. It exists as we have a physical self, which has its own necessities we can't ignore. But we should go and vary our relation with our body and with society as much as we can. So physical ontology means, yes, there are constraints in terms of historical context we live in, and also in terms of the needs of the body or the needs of deep psychology. Those kinds of aspects of psychology you can't easily vary. But given that, we should have a critical ontology which we distinguish the necessary from the unnecessary, and have a kind of self-invention. So liberty is a self-invention. And Foucault, in some places, kind of rather reads that back into antiquity as well. Again, though he sometimes emphasizes historical specificity, he sometimes reads that back into antique understanding of the arts of living, or to get out of the self. This kind of 19th century interest in liberty, which includes the Baudelairean kind of aesthetic, poetic self-creation, or possibility of varied interpretation of how we dress, how we appear, what best reaction is to the kind of society we live in. And also, Foucault is interested in associated ideas in the 19th century of extreme liberty. Way that there's a growth in the 19th century of ideas of extreme liberty, which express themselves in anarchism, in aesthetics, in certain philosophers. I presume we're pretty much at the end.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so thank you for your patience.
You have questions? Yes.
Thank you, Tom. I have a question about general aspect of Korean understanding of the self. I did this thought of self is a prevalent, very relatively all of this discourse about self. I think in that scope, try always to not give us some criteria or some points or some static points or some rules. So we can say that there is, of course, very familiar area with liberals with liberals understanding of the self. Yeah. So and this point is very clear about revolution of Shaw. I know. So he, as you say very well, he was very excited about this revolution. He had sympathy. So after that, he realized very quickly that it doesn't work. Something doesn't work about all of it. So I think there is a very clear problem in this understanding of the self. If you think the self is always something consistent for something real, so suddenly that means something about evil that you ignore. So what do you think about this problem, Koyan?
Evil. Well, of course, evil sort of term Foucault discusses. I guess he regards to theological or metaphysical, but there is a kind of sense of evil in Foucault, which is that way much capabilities of turning against individual freedom, possibilities of individual self-creation. So, yeah, I didn't use the language of good and evil about the Iranian Revolution, but I suppose he would say that he saw the kind of possibilities of shared spirituality, promoting kind of freedom and self-creation. And that would be his idea of good, and his idea of evil would be when you have a constraining power, which intrusive constraining power from above, which prevents individuals from exploring their own spiritual self-creation or self-creation in any other terms they find interesting. So, I mean, there's a sense of evil, and it's a sense that power is evil. I think he sometimes refers to the art of not being done. So I think there's a sense in Foucault government power is evil but unavoidable. He also says that power is unavoidable, power is negative. But there's certainly a sense that well, if power, well, power is everywhere. If there's various forms of power interacting, and that one kind of power not being too dominant, that's okay, more or less. No doubt could always be improved. But I think there is a sense of what you could call even Foucault, the sense that power is concentrated. I suppose there's, discipline and punish, his work on the modern prison. Again, he wouldn't want to use that language, but I think you would say there's something evil about the idea of prison. Which of course is generally about how a society is governed, but not just in terms of political structures. So it's not that Foucault's anti-modernist, we see one problem of modernism being this model of surveillance, the prison's model of surveillance. The prison is a model of control. The way it's based, modern prison is based originally on ideas of reform of the prisoner through religion, through a kind of very monolithic understanding of how to make the prisoner pure and repenting. And then that extends into psychology. Again, Foucault is not just anti-psychology or psychiatry, but he thinks there's great risk of abuse. So, one of Foucault's major concerns is coercive discourse. And so that's a kind of evil, potential evil, Foucault. The discourse that's coerced. So the psychiatry can get kind of evil if the patient is coerced into uttering words which satisfy the psychiatrist that the patient is cured. For Foucault, that would be too monolithic, too coercive. And Foucault doesn't like prisons. He doesn't have a clear. He doesn't really have a program for a society about prisons. Maybe he didn't believe it would be completely possible to have a society without prisons. He clearly believes that the less prison is used, the more there are other forms of punishment which are more concerned with reparation and healing the community rather than sticking people in places where they're coerced and surveyed in the most extreme ways. So there's always a sense of evil for Foucault, the concentration of power and not being able, any individual really not being able to develop their own individuality. And certainly a society in which whole societies are being coerced into kind of very narrow understanding of what an individual would be. And can't be free from surveillance, can't be free from very monolithic concentration of state power or any other kind of power. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Derek, for this speech. Well, I have two questions. First question about its first position and second position. Maybe there's no division like this, but really, I think there are different positions in his text about the ethics, because as you said, he defines ethics as a relation of self to itself in terms of its moral agency. And it means, his position in this definition is very connected to talking to yourself. But this concept, parrhesia, trans speech, or really speech, I think with this concept, he extends beyond these definitions, because with this concept, I think the topic, the concept emerged in his last courses in
It's like in the 1980s. Before the last disaster.
yeah. So that's the most a concept maybe. Well, with this concept, he goes beyond the talking to yourself, because free speech is connected to also other person. So is there any differences between his first text and also second, last text, a text about the ethics?
Well, I think there is. Foucault himself did distinguish his work between stages concerned with discourse, concerned with power, concerned with ethics, which I guess is how most people would define it. It's just that I think it's not that these completely separate stages. I think some of these ethical issues are present early on. I mean, after all, as I said, the book that makes him famous is History of Madness. And I suppose you can see that's a book about how some people are categorized in a way, which means they lose any control over their right to define themselves and develop themselves. So for Foucault, the early form of the psychiatric hospital, there isn't any psychiatry going on in the first institutions for the insane. Yeah, of course, they're notoriously brutal and unpleasant and uncaring. And Foucault engages in a kind of comparison with ages, probably a bit simplistic and idealized in regard to ages, but he says there's more freedom of the man. I don't think Foucault suggesting those who everyone who's defined as insane can just be left to behave as freely as everyone. But I think Foucault thinks you can minimize coercion of people who are defined as insane. Anyway, so that's a fairly early concern, and I think that really is concerned with ethics. Of course, it's quite personal because Foucault himself had serious psychiatric health problems as a student. I think he made suicide attempts. He did spend some time in the psychiatric clinic at École Normale Supérieure, the famous university in Paris, where he studied and of course had very good facilities at that time. I know Foucault's often critical of psychiatric and medical power. He makes it clear sometimes he's not rejecting it. Of course, his father was a doctor, and Foucault once says in an interview that he's trying to carry on work with his father. So I'm not sure that answers what he says. So rather drifted off in my own concerns. But is that helpful?
Well, okay. My following question. Yes, as you said, it is very personal, this first position. But
Yes.
and also he is very critical of normative ethics. He doesn't refer to what is right, what is wrong in terms of morality. His concern is not to determine some, ethical rules, because, as you said, very personal. And he focused on actually set legislation of subjects. But when it comes to the the last topics he taught, especially this concept, and when we look at the articles, what is enlightenment and also what is critic, he tried to find actually some rules implicit, because this also give us a rule. For instance, frank speech is a kind of norm. Even if when you tell the truth, if it cause a risk for you, still you insist tell the truth. So this is very connected to categorical imperative Kant. Maybe I exaggerate a little bit, but it's a kind of norm. That's why in the last late articles or books, I think he tried to find some criteria to be moral. What do you think?
Yeah. But yes, he wanted sort of non-coercive criteria. I mean, as I said towards the end of my talk, he is concerned with the constraints of ontology. So really he needs that what we are as an individual, which in some respects is a non-social being, is physical, biological being, and also the way we're in a society, specific characteristics that provides a kind of basis for our constraints. The tree doesn't like, he's not offering any set rules or any way of generating rules. That utilitarian theorist or a deontologist theorist or anyone that those kind of minds might try to do. But I guess he's developing a criteria. I mean, in the end, what moral philosophers do, I suppose, more developing criteria. They might be engaged in specific issues. They're trying to develop criteria for deciding how we say something is immoral or immoral. So I suppose, Foucault develops criteria, which include, well, we can't just deny ontology in this sense he uses it, but also clearly that you can't deny other people's autonomy. I mean, there is something Kantian about that. I mean that's fine. He was very interested in Kant. The a history of cloudiness, of course, was actually a doctrine d'attaque, a kind of super doctrine which doesn't exist in the French system anymore. It was at that time a requirement to be an academic. But so you have to write second thesis about a second thesis on Kant's anthropology. And the other early book I referred to, the order of things, or words and things in the original French, really there's something rather Kantian about it, sort of being a sense of the Kantian sense of self takes us beyond the limits of some of the structures of the early modern thought that he sees as including some very constraining aspects, a kind of very constraining kind of rationalism, whereas Kant allows for creative subjectivity, a historically variable subject. So, well, there might be, in a very general way, a kind of relationship between Foucault saying we have to respect everyone's autonomy, Kant. I think he's putting it in a context which is very more historicizing, more emphasizing variability of subjectivity, more emphasizing aesthetics as the possibility of choice. As I said, that it's interesting that he doesn't deal with the critique. I don't know why. It'd be interesting to. I don't think it's anywhere where he even explains this. There are accounts for it. Of course, the third critique has been used for discussing ethics and politics. Obviously, the lectures of Hannah Arendt on Kant's political philosophy are an example. So yes, there is a Kantian aspect to Foucault, but the kind of things you get in Kant where you shouldn't tell a lie even if the murderer is coming. You should lie to him about where your friend is. I mean, these kind of rather extreme suggestions of Kant. Certainly, that's not in Foucault. There is, I suppose, a kind of demand for heroism in Foucault. But I guess, yes, he does, but it's more like the exemplary person. It's a bit, I'd say it's a bit Nietzsche, if anything, that I noticed. Also, some people see something a bit Emersonian about Foucault, or claim. So, Emerson, the American transcendentalists emphasize a kind of spiritual perfections. So there is a kind of perfectionism figure. I don't think quite in terms of Emerson, but certainly has some kind of relationship with Nietzsche. The individual, we should admire the individual who does self-create, who does challenge and is brave. So in that sense, there are norms in Foucault, but I guess the norms are more about what is exemplary. So I suppose you could try and read Foucault and try and find a lot of implicit rules. But it looks to me like Foucault is trying to do is say we respect everyone else's autonomy, we try and reduce coercion, and we look for exemplary people rather than sort of Kantian utilitarian sets of sort of perfect rationalistic rules. But I think someone behind you.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your question. I had two questions. First one is why this subject matter is impacting on you? It's another it's and after that, second one, I want to learn the capacity of Aristotelian capacity and the capacity in terms of Foucault's perspective, especially state intervention and formation of subject, etc. What kind of difference with the Aristotelian perspective about capacity and Foucault's perspective?
Well, I am keen individual interest in Foucault. I suppose there must be some psychological reasons. I can't really pick by them. really, I think I'm a bit not able to take that kind of distance from myself, but I've been interested in Foucault for a long time. Then tend to be more interested over time. Um, why? Well, probably uh, uh, interest in politics, and inadequacy of Marxism. We're going to look into my biography. I used to be a Marxist. Now I'm leaning more towards liberalism. But I think Foucault is a way of not exactly being liberal, something rather libertarian, about Foucault. I think it's something, a kind of libertarianism in Foucault, which I think is better at, might be better at answering kind of critics of liberalism, whether they're Marxist or kind of anti-liberal right. Some ways, the way Foucault has a kind of social historical context and is able to marry that with a kind of deep sense of what's going on in itself. I think Foucault offers a way of looking at liberty which is resistant, as I said, to illiberal, or though some people see it as illiberal or anti-liberal. Liberalism, much more a general sense. Of course, the word liberalism has very different meanings, different contexts. Of course, the word liberal in Turkey probably generally means, tends to be given rather conservative meaning. So I would call Foucault a conservative. He's clearly a left-leaning kind of person. But unlike some people left, he's very suspicious of being state. But he's not an anarchist either. I mean, it's more that he wants this kind of power which is dispersed. Kind of power I think which maximizes autonomy. So we can, I think he's pretty skeptical about anarchists. I don't think he thinks it's possible for society to be completely spontaneously ordered. But that whatever kind of central order there is should be rather minimal and allow various kinds of individual autonomy and self-organization. So anyway, there might be a kind of psychological aspect to this. But I'm saying in terms of political development, I'm interested in Foucault, someone who I suppose, I think, has a view of liberty which is better than the others. They're being interested in what liberty is. And there's also, because our next Marxist or so Foucault, and some people insist that he was a Marxist, but usually as a kind of next way, it's insult. But he says he was the Marxist, then he was. He was a member of the French Communist Party for a while. That's right, when he fell behind. I'm not sure that even was used Marxist is that time. The French Communist Party was the largest party in France. So the problem is the sort of thing you did if you're a left-leaning type person. I think Foucault's sensibility is always rather individualistic, libertarian, autonomous. Aristotelianism. Well, I'm sure Foucault thinks Aristotle is important as a thinker. I think in some very broad sense, we might see Foucault in relation to Aristotle as a kind of virtue, because the idea of self-development, self-perfection in self-perfection, not actually a word he uses, but anyway, this acting on ourselves and the interest in exemplary heroes. I think that does relate to virtue theory. And I think he could look at Foucault as a virtue theorist. I think it would be rather difficult the way that Aristotle is, it sees very exact definitions of what virtue is. So it's complex but exact. Every virtue has different kind of meaning between excess and crack, and it's very linked to your social status as well. You can only have the greatest virtue for Aristotle, really, if you're a property person, or maybe a philosopher. I don't think he really envisages unproperted philosophers. So I think there's a kind of hierarchy intrinsic to Aristotle, a rather narrow sense of humanity having a purpose, individuals having a purpose. I think Foucault would say that the Aristotle's imposing something too narrow sense of what a good life is, what possibly starts. So Foucault's emphasizing the variety of ways in which we can act on ourselves and be ethical. I think for Aristotle, it seems very clear there are certain ways to behave, certain kinds of virtue. certain ways to use practical reason. It's all much more deterministic, systematic, and much, and also, as I said, very linked to ideas of social and class status. Because I think comparison between Foucault and Aristotle is very interesting, and in some very broad sense, you could say they're both virtue theorists. I mean, in many ways, Foucault is anti-absolute, trying to.
That's
I want to ask something.
yes.
And I'm putting a question, but I can make there. You have a question.
What the hell are you fine?
Okay. So thank you. So I want to ask about the relationship between. Actually, we have been coming back to this topic maybe, but individual freedom and communal freedom. So individual freedom, as you say, entails the right of the individual to be different from majority. And in some sense, I can particularly see. I mean, apparently there is a passion between individual freedom and communal freedom. But also maybe there is a foundation relationship or emerging relationship. So in what way individual freedom contributes to communal or political freedom, and in what way they are at tension with each other in this framework? Because you talk about ontology, so I imagine some sort of ontological or rounding relationship, the individual freedom and political freedom, or is there such a thing, or only tension?
Well, I suppose Foucault is really coming from the direction of criticizing anything that's a kind of top-down and coercive, or anything that's conformist. I think he'd recognizes that collective action is necessary, but he regards that as something that should be seen as very varied, not bringing people into a very monolithic idea of what a society is, what a community is, what a class is, or anything like that. So I guess Foucault leads interest in what defines community, what defines political structure. But it's in terms which are very skeptical of there being a very structured community. I think he recognizes that he would say that there has to be a state, there has to be a politics, has to be identifiable with the community in some way. But I guess what he's mainly concerned with is how we minimize the coercion. So communal freedom, communal power. I'm trying to think if there's a way in which Foucault might address that in the terms you mentioned. But I think Foucault is really trying to criticize the communal conformism. Well, I think there's a sense that Foucault can't avoid these things, but I think it's also a strong sense that it's better to challenge them rather than just go along with them. So, but obviously, he thinks there should be civic and public liberty, because if liberty goes beyond just very individual and private celebration, if it goes beyond that, we must have public aspects. So, I think if there's a view of what it is for there to be a strong public or strong community, would be one which is able to deal with challenges, is able to deal with a parrhesiastic person, the person who challenges the majority. So there is a Foucauldian view of communal freedom. I think it's very much that it's something which must not impose majoritarianism, must allow dissent, and must be, to some degree, maybe steered by the heroism of a Socrates. So sometimes Foucault expresses admiration of Socrates. I don't think that he would see himself as a Platonist, at least the idea of Socrates as a challenging individual. There's always really, in terms of society, can be improved by the challenging individual or the whether it's Socrates or whether it's the because that's a kind of quality. I mean, the dandy is itself a kind of communal norm, but it's a very it's a rather bottom up, spontaneous one, relatively speaking. I think Foucault recognised that can be coercive, but it's better than just everything being defined from the top down. But we can't define our freedom just in terms of legal rights, political rights, and certainly not just in terms of their strong state, but in terms of the variability of the ways in which people defend themselves and avoiding conformism. I mean, that could become conformist. As I say, Foucault has some respect for the aesthetic self-creation of early Christians. He's very critical of the way that becomes institutionalized and the way of gathering ascetics into monasteries that are overall the control of society. Church acquires political power.
All systems exist what we can and want. Each or other are shaped by machines with skill, value, vision. And if certain is weaker, can we still focus about in the way Foucault talks? Is this an old problem or is it more important?
Sorry, is this one problem?
Yeah, it's more important today for
Well, I suppose yes, and that time they'll be very satisfactory because a sort of similar way that modern technology, and you have literal or narrow sense of technology, but also all forms of capacity. You certainly could say the way modern state has more capacity and therefore can coerce and intervene more and more deeply. Of course, one of the things he's talking about in his later text is biopower. And the way he talked about how the state moves from having a power over life, in a sense, that's the power to impose death. So we could say that the state at one point is defined, if sovereignty is defined by its right to take life, to execute people, possibly create wars. But then Foucault says, well, in the modern state, you have the biopower, which is the wish and the right the state gives itself to prolong life, which sounds beneficial. Foucault puts it in quite extreme terms. He talks about the Holocaust and says, well, the Nazi genocide Holocaust of the Jews is actually, at least defined by Nazis, as a kind of public health. So, in terms of general rhetoric, also where death panels are right. So it's like being used to kill Jews is stored in the medical facilities of the camp. So again, he said to rather extreme way of putting it. But obviously for Foucault is very serious. What feels like beneficial might feel like beneficial forms of power. The state is trying to increase our life. They have a very sinister side to them. So again, it's this wish that things should be coercive or centralized. So I suppose for Foucault model, what Holocaust one model, the other is a kind of hospital where the state is trying to prolong life. And I suppose for Foucault that becomes a bit of an extreme in itself. It doesn't have a great deal to say about that, except to say that it increases power and it can be intrusive. So I think Foucault is, I think, suspicious. That could lead to a situation people being kept alive by modern medicine, whether they feel they've got much quality of life or not. So this is a possible danger. Of course, this is partly expressed also through discussion, liberalism, though how to interpret that is quite contentious. But certainly, I think Foucault is interested in the way that neoliberalism tries to reduce power, but might also increase power. So, unlike what a lot of people assume, I think Foucault is just straightforward critic of neoliberalism. I think he's actually take seriously way in which neoliberalism is self-interested in reducing state power, but he's concerned that it might reproduce powers in other ways. That the state power is not the only form of power. So well, he actually considers two kinds of neoliberalism, really. So one is the ordo-liberal model in Germany after the Second World War, and then the a more American-oriented one linked with Chicago economics, which he essentially sees the Chicago model as rather, well, he sees the German model as very much trying to reinforce German democracy. He sees the American model as reducing a kind of moralizing power, as it were, to be economic rationality reduces moral coercion. I think Foucault would also have some suspicions that might go along with a kind of other forms of coercion. I just wondered, it's a rather controversial area. But I think we find most people work on Foucault disagree. But I actually think he's quite interested, not uncritical, but interested in neoliberal attempts to reduce state power. I'm drifting a bit away from what you're talking about, but he talks about neoliberalism in lectures on biopolitics, and that's because neoliberalism is an attempt to create some kind of public welfare, social welfare. So people just regard neoliberalism as just some kind of promoting some kind of anti-social economic anarchy or something. That itself is rooted in certain ideas of how to improve public welfare, which of course you can really disagree with, but I think Foucault takes it seriously. That we can't just, he's not going to dismiss neoliberalism as just really capitalist imposing something on society. He has some interest in how a kind of market society might have ways in which markets produce sexual power. You might have some suspicions of concentrations of power. Obviously, he really likes that 19th century about the economy, physical economy. He talks about the way in which employers may have links with the state, which make workers sort of only setting free. Because the employer has a lot of influence with the police, with the issuing of identity cards and so on. So it's a sense in Foucault is a danger that the capitalist being unified into the state. I think he's at least neoliberalism he sees as an attempt to reduce the state. But then as he puts in the context of lectures on biopolitics, he's also concerned that it might be a way of it might itself be a form of increasing state power because the neoliberalism is a matter of state policy. I'm sure I have fun that answered you. But also, we could take this back to discipline punishment panopticon. So the model of panopticon is the Foucault model of how 19th century society up to now puts us under surveillance. So this is actually exist before. Some of what Foucault says rather implies a kind of sometimes seems slightly nostalgic that it was better in the state than how so much power so intrusive. Actually, I don't think Foucault wants to go back to the past saying, mate, I think Foucault thinks that pre-modern forms of association can have some value if that they're counter to state power. Because, as I said, Foucault doesn't think we should take power as just being a negative thing. It can be a positive thing. So neoliberalism and biopolitics can themselves have different versions. But anyway, yes, it's a modern problem. I think Foucault is concerned with freedom and coercion in all societies. But yeah, I think Foucault, like other thinkers of very different kinds, like Frankfurt School on the one side, or the kind of Austrian school people who are sort of forerunners of neoliberalism. There's a very broad range of people who be concerned that the modern society puts us under more surveillance, more pressure from the state, more of a new kind of conformance to fit in what the state demands. And I suppose what I like from about Foucault really is that he kind of opens the way that he seems sometimes to be leaning in one direction, sometimes in another. What he thinks the problems or solutions are.
This close up this question because due to time.
No, I asked how to. I mean, it's take.
That'd be great. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
So, thank you.